Tonight, we're going to cover several topics. They're all inside the larger framework of sort of spatial planning, what used to be the term that APA used for this area. One of the major areas is rural small town planning. I'm then going to give an overview of the spatial, and then I'll also touch on another area briefly, which is waterfront planning. So let me just look at some of the past year comments in this area from the fall exam. What is the best method for controlling growth in a small rural area? How do you control growth in a small town? Other people felt adequately prepared for it. We had one person that said not on their exam, but I question that because everybody else, we have multiple questions. Things about ag laws coming to the nuisance, right to farm, best way to preserve agricultural land, question on ag land protection. People liked Pam when she did it before. I mean, Kim when she did it before. Let's see. A question about urban growth boundaries, TDRs, and so on. And that's similar to what we've seen in the past, sometimes Main Street program, things like that. You'll get these comments. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Kim. Let her introduce herself. And we'll start up from here. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm Kim Glass-Castro. I currently serve as the Planning, Zoning, and Building Director for the Village of Palm Springs, Florida. Palm Springs is really a mid-sized city now. It's no longer small. We're about 24,000 residents, although we think it's more, that we're undercounted, and so we're looking forward to the 2020 census. Other than my day job, I'm also vice mayor in the town of Lake Park. Lake Park is about 8,300 residents, 2 square miles. So we're a small historic town in northern Palm Beach County. I grew up in central Illinois in a small farm town that when I was growing up, to do any major shopping, we'd have to go into Peoria. We didn't have any major shopping, just day-to-day convenience type items in the little town I grew up in. My first job, other than babysitting, was detasseling corn. And, we used to run around and tear up cornfields in the middle of the winter in these 4-wheel drive pickup trucks. So I have a country background, although I'm in urban Palm Beach County now.
She's also the one that got me to do this. Talked me into it by leaving a message on my answering machine that if I didn't tell her in an hour I was the new PDO going to be doing this. She was section chair and then later the president of APA Florida. So anyway, she's been helping us for many years doing this and got me started doing it.
And we appreciate Henry and Susan doing this consistently for not only our section, but really all APA members. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is just characteristics of the land, as well as small communities and the economy of small towns and rural areas. When it comes to rural and small town planning, we can really divide it into these 3 sections. So the first section, land, we have cultural considerations, which is more nostalgia. I remember when this was just cow pasture, that kind of thing. And then you have historical aspects like battlefields and Indian burial mounds and historic buildings. And then you have the environment, open spaces and waterways and national parks and even beaches here in Florida. So when we think about the land, a lot of times we think about the family farm. About the time of the American Revolution in 1776, 90% of the US population was in rural areas. But by 1990, less than 25% of our population was still in the rural area and represented only 2.6% of the labor force. So farmers, continue to be a diminishing career and source of employment in the US. rural areas that once played a vital role in our economic growth, the economic growth of America, are now struggling. Rural communities are shrinking, and they're looking for alternative methods to foster development and to compete globally. This quote here, it talks about sensory experience of the rural area, and it always reminds me of nostalgia, and it reminds me of the Rodney Atkins song, Take It Back Road. If any of you are country music fans, that, you know, take it back road, get right with my soul. So a lot of it is just personal and sensory and nostalgia for the rural areas. But another aspect is preservation, and preservation of our rural lands, of our important national parks and historic monuments. And kind of that consideration is land preservation, preservation of rural agricultural areas also, that it's really more and more challenging for farmers, for property owners to keep doing what they're doing because they can sell their land and make a profit and move into the city. Here in Palm Beach County, we have the agricultural reserve area, where the whole objective is to preserve agricultural farmland and to preserve it through giving development rights or value to the land that the property owners can then still be able to have value. Even though they're preserving their land for agricultural purposes, they can preserve value and be able to get bank loans. So they're able to reserve equity in the land, but they're able to sell off development rights that can be used in the more urban area where it might be more appropriate for densities and intensities, but also still preserve the outer edges of the urban area for more rural or agricultural purposes. So some means of preserving land, whether it be for agricultural purposes or for environmental purposes, are PDRs, conservation easements, TDRs, land trusts, cluster zoning, down zoning, ag zoning, urban growth boundary. So I know in past exams, they've talked a lot about transfer of development rights, which we'll go into in the next couple slides, and as well as use of conservation easements or strict growth boundaries to preserve rural and open spaces. PDR stands for purchase of development rights versus TDR, transfer of development rights. Oh, you got a slide on it.
I have a slide on it. That may be the difference in the new
Yep,
slides.
yep.
Okay.
So here we go, PDR. So they're very similar in that that development rights can be transferred to another area, and then the rural or agricultural or environmental area is preserved with a conservation easement. And so the development rights otherwise associated with that land is sold or transferred to another property, to another developer.
Well, the transfer occurs with TDRs, transfer of development rights. Purchase development rights typically,
or like a land trust purchases them.
they're typically taking them off the land. They mean transferred in that sense, but they're being retired, typically to whatever entity takes them. They may get them as a conservation easement or whatever, but that's one of the differences between a purchase of development right and a transfer of development rights, right? So.
Right, I have a note. Do we still have a land trust slide?
Yes, I think so. Let me see. Yes, here's the land trust. I have to apologize for this. I didn't realize till late this afternoon that the most recent set of slides that I did once upon a time, I hadn't given Kim. Okay,
And all my notes are on the old slides.
and all the notes are on the old slides. So you'll have one or two slides here that show up new.
So through land trusts, they typically then have resources to buy development rights or to outright buy property and then lease it back to whether it's the farmer or the agency that's going to offer it to maintain it or utilize it. So land trusts are you can think of land trusts in terms of community land trusts for affordable housing, but this is a use of land trusts to preserve rural or environmental historical lands.
Probably the two best known are probably the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land. And I actually worked for the Nature Conservancy. I worked on the scientific side, called Flora Natural Areas Inventory. But yeah, there's all sorts of these around. There's also trusts specifically focused on just trying to get agricultural protection.
Right.
To run the country. Right.
So this is a slide on transfer development rights, where the agricultural or environmental land is what they call the sending zone, and any density associated with it, any development rights associated with it is transferred to the more urban area where it's appropriate to have densities and intensities. And so by having TDRs, it preserves the outer areas and puts density intensity into the inner areas.
And you need to know about TDRs because you'll see in the past, that's your comments. We're getting a fair number of questions on TDRs and specifically focusing on sending areas and receiving areas. And that's one of the reasons why, and I don't know if this slide is one you have or not, but this tells about how and when TDRs work and also gives you some links for getting more information on the TDRs.
So kind of I don't want to say if it's a challenge, but one reason why TDRs aren't as effective as some other programs is that you have to have a willing seller of TDRs that's willing to place conservation easements or restrictions on their property. So you have to have willing participants, where in other methods like a urban growth boundary, it's a established regulatory means of controlling new growth and development in outer rural and open areas. So this shows clustering of development in order to aggregate open spaces. And a planned unit development, which I'm sure you are all familiar with that term, is one form of regulatory means to encourage clustering. And so in the next slide, this shows the traditional subdivision on the left, typical lots, versus one that's aggregated so that you have smaller lots and then an aggregation of open space in the same project boundary area.
Resulting in getting the open space area protected. This is something in the Ag Reserve, which I would, by the way, was project manager for the Water Management District. And the co-project managers on the Ag Reserve Master Plan. And of course, what they use also, besides a TDR program in the Ag Reserve, they use cluster development with an incentive bonus. So if you cluster your development on either 40% or 20% of the land, they'll give you density bonuses as well as doing the clustering. And those are all incentives to try to protect the open space in agricultural areas. And you can see both of these have the same number of units and things in them.
So then we mentioned the urban growth boundary, which is a regulatory means to limit public services and facilities outside of the boundary. And so by limiting those services and facilities, and it keeps it more rural or less dense than inside the growth boundary.
And we have an example here in Miami-Dade. They have an urban.
That's debatable.
Well,
They keep moving it.
But it's set up, theirs is set up to be moved every 5 years. They do have a time frame for when it's supposed to move. And because they're a charter county, it is the county that makes the decision on whether or not to make exception to that when the cities or the other folks want to move it. But the intent is, it's a tool used really well around the country for trying to protect agricultural rural areas.
So rural by design, do they still have little history type, need to know who the
Sometimes,
author was?
yes.
And
They do ask about Randall Aaron, and they do ask about rural by design, although it's the second version of it now, but they do ask. So go ahead.
so the whole gist of this publication was to preserve open space and rural community character, that he was advocating for rural elements like greenways and linked open spaces, and that was necessary for healthy communities. And that kind of then is the next one in the transect zoning. Yep. If you're especially into urban form, then you've seen this type of diagram before on transect zoning that goes on the left from rural areas to the high density, intensity, very urban commercial districts on the right-hand side. And so it's a transitional slide that shows increase in density and intensity as you move into more urban, with the left side being the most, I should say the least dense and intense, with large open spaces and agricultural areas. And then Ebenezer Howard, the Garden City movement. So garden cities were planned, self-contained communities that were surrounded by green belts. And so these garden cities were proportionate. They had, a little bit of housing, industry, agriculture. So Letchworth was the first garden city, Letchworth outside of London, if that's a little trivia question that's still on the exam. And this Garden City movement influenced the Greenbelt towns of the Roosevelt administration.
And also the new towns that came after World War II. That James Rouse and others. Okay.
Now, did I need to say more on transect zoning? Because I have more notes on my things are out of order.
You can. We'll go back to it.
So as I was saying, this is a basis for form-based code. There's typically 6 zones, T1 to T6, the rural to the urban core, but then there's the 7th transect that's on the far right, that's a special district. And
the concepts from Patrick Geddes, who's the father of regional planning. And Geddes had something called the Valley section. It showed the activities of humans across the landscape. We'll see more about this later on. We'll touch on it again. We touched on it once. And the Valley section. And so it started down this road showing some intensity of man's activities across the landscape. So that got picked up by 20 and turned it into this transect zoning, which also is used for the smart code okay, and is becoming more and more the standard for more innovative planning across the country. So,
And I have that Getty's, his big push was that humans thrive in different environments, that it's a matter of choice. And so that's why we need to offer different choices. But I also have that with these transects, there's no intermixing of rural and urban elements. So there's no office buildings in preserve areas and rural areas, that they're all very distinct. So unintended consequences is rural gentrification. If you think of college towns and colonial era hamlets, it's kind of the up and coming thing where people want to move. So you have urbanites moving to the small town because of the charm. And it's becoming more and more popular with e-commerce and telecommuting that you don't need to live in the metro area. And also, it's been learned that preserved land that has conservation easements or other protective measures tend to increase the values of the adjacent properties because nothing's going to happen on the land that's next to you. So we know past exams have had at least one question on right to farm laws. And most states have right to farm laws, and it's to protect farmers and ranchers from nuisance lawsuits. They were there first, they have a right to farm, and as cities grow or extend into rural areas, people tend to then start objecting to smells and noises and use of pesticides and herbicides, and so start complaining about the farmers who were there first. So a lot of local governments are preempted from restricting agricultural practices through state regulations. So a term is coming to the nuisance that you might need to know. So coming to the nuisance, that's, like we're talking about, the farmer's been there, and then the urban area grows in proximity to the farmer. And so the residents start considering the farm activities to be a nuisance. So they have come to the nuisance. It was the farmer, the agricultural use that was there first, and the new resident has moved in proximity to what was already established there. And so the courts have been ruling in favor of the farmers. And so this is known as coming to the nuisance in some of the court cases. And the next slide, Spur Industries versus Deli Web. So just some brief facts. So Deli Web Development Company brought a suit for injunction on a feedlot based on a public nuisance claim. So the feedlot had been established in the area long before the developer started buying up properties and planning for residential uses in proximity to the feedlot. And this case dates back to the 50s, and then with the expansion of Sun City in the Phoenix area, that's when the developer brought the lawsuit claiming that the lots, his residential lots, were unfit for residential development because of the operation of the feedlot. But the trial court the courts did rule in favor of the feedlot, the farmer. The synopsis is, when a developer has brought into previously agricultural or industrial area a new population, the developer must indemnify. So in this question that's on the screen, Spur Industries versus Deli Web, it's considered an important land use case because it's a discussion of which of the following doctrines coming to the nuisance. The other aspect of rural planning is the environmental considerations. You know, in rural areas, you have agricultural runoff, you have animal waste, you have considerations of garbage disposal because you don't have the garbage trucks that come twice a week to pick up the trash. So you have those kind of water and solid waste considerations. And there are cases of abuse of right to farm laws that farmers, agricultural industries don't have respect for the land. It's big business. And so it leads to some of these environmental issues. The Clean Water Act of 72 and Water Quality Act of 87 discussed point source versus non-point source. So point source is if, you know, like there's a pipe so you can directly see where it's coming from, versus a non-point source like stormwater runoff. And that total maximum daily loads needed to be considered to deal with pollutant loads, and looking at all upstream properties to determine when point sources could not be determined. And this is really your specialty, Henry. So.
Well, just TMDL, we haven't seen it really come up on the exam yet, but at some point it will, because local governments are having to react to it, because it's basically how much pollution can come from a sub-basin. And often based on a watershed, and that's what this next picture shows, is basically what is a watershed. And basically, if you look at the topographic high areas where the rainfall falls and it goes one way, and it goes down to a riverine or stream type system, all the water that falls within that basin is a watershed. And they've asked about the definitions of watershed or versus an aquifer. And of course, an aquifer is the underground portion. So some of that rainfall that falls down on the land may go down into an aquifer where measurable amounts of water can be pulled out for a usable purpose. So know the definition. We covered that when I did water planning, real briefly when I did environmental NEPA that night. I gave you some definitions of aquifer. I gave you some stuff on watersheds. This just visually shows you it again. It's that watershed divide. All the rainfall falling goes towards that stream tributary, and then they connect up and eventually go out into the ocean. So if you can talk about small watersheds, you know, particular area that go down to a particular stream, or you can talk about a watershed like the Mississippi watershed, which is, you know, half of the central part of the country, because it includes all the things like the Ohio River and all these other big huge rivers that come, Tennessee River, things like that, all come into it and then go down to the Gulf of Mexico. So just know what watershed is, know what aquifers are. All right. Back to that, and then.
So wildlife corridors, protection of open spaces in consideration of the natural wildlife. You know, we see wildlife crossings over highways, animal bridges, ecoducts, animal overpasses. You know, here in Florida, we have Alligator Alley that has the panther culverts going underneath.
So the road is lifted up so that the panthers can go underneath the road. And their fence is directed towards some of those. Susan dealt with a lot of the permitting on it. Go over by the mic, Susan.
I know.
Okay.
No,
Susan got all excited here.
well, no, actually, there's a lot more prevalence of the use of something like that now. Like in the northern part of Florida, there's bear crossings that are built into a lot of the roads. One going into the Keys was designed to deal with panthers, all kinds of critters. When you get south of the C-111 canal, they're designed to deal with manatees and alligators. One of the first set that went in Florida, as an example, were the ones that went under I-75 across the Everglades. And DOT put cameras on them. And one of the things they discovered, they were put in there to deal mostly with like the deer and things like that. But what they found out is that every kind of critter uses them. If they're there, they're going to be used by whoever is in the area.
So kind of similar to a wildlife corridor is a greenway, which is a connection of open spaces, preserve areas. So you have connectivity, whether it's just for enhancement of open spaces or wildlife purposes or a recreational trail.
Just a classic example is the Emerald Necklace in the Boston area. And since they have conferences in Boston, they have sessions on the Emerald Necklace. So once or twice, not routinely, but we've seen a question come up on an example of a greenway being the Emerald Necklace in Boston. Hasn't come up a lot, but it's come up.
So next we're moving on to the rural community or the small town community. So typically when you think the rural community, you think a quaint northeastern village or a small western watering hole. We're going to talk a little bit about different characteristics. So a small village historically has developed over time. It's not a planned development, a seaside. It's a historic settlement that has continued to exist. It's a working community versus vacation and second home replicas of real communities. You have several generations living in the village and everyone knows each other. And all your basic needs are met with a mix of uses in the village. The typical density of the rural village is medium density, which is 4 dwelling units per acre.
And that's a question that's come up on the exam also.
Typical density, medium, 4 dwelling units per acre. So if you go to, so in the village, you typically, and I'll go back one, you typically have a mix of uses, a mix of housing types, but it's traditional development with sidewalks and street trees, and it's at a pedestrian scale. So here's a little quiz. So thinking in the rural community, what's the poverty rate versus an urban area? Higher, lower, or the same?
Go ahead, answer up.
Higher.
It's typically higher because you have less education. You have farming or mining or different trades. Birth rate, higher, lower, or the same as an urban area?
Higher.
Higher, kind of then again, because you have less education
People work at the farm.
and well, and having grown up in a small town, there's not a whole lot to do at night. The fastest growing age cohort in a rural area.
$45 to $65.
Anybody else?
65 plus.
I'll do 0 to 16.
Okay, so I heard 0 to 16, 45, 65, and 65 plus. What's interesting is it's 65 plus and 0 to 16.
Because the working generation typically moves out of the rural community to find a job in the urban area.
Makes sense.
So then in the rural community, you have in-migration or out-migration? Typically out.
This one's important also, because this has come up on the exam. Aspects of this.
So your small town, your rural town, it's typically compact. Again, it's medium density, 4 units per acre on average. It'll have a little downtown, a main street type of area. You have a mix of uses. It's at a pedestrian scale. You can, typically walk from your house down into the commercial area. A lot of times it's represented with a large civic space, where they have the 4th of July picnic. And if you think movies with quaint little rural towns, they always have a quaint little square in the middle of the town. The streets are smaller scale. It's not your urban arterials like we have here in South Florida. And everything is concentrated from the downtown core area and building out, but it's still very compact.
This also comes from Rural by Design by Randall Aaron. This is some of the characteristics, the 10 characteristics I think we've got that about what form a small town of 9. Something like that. Anyway.
So with out-migration of kind of the working age, then you have some stress on farming. Plus with the value of land, you have stress pressures on family farms to be sold to the agricultural industry, to, big business, or if it's in proximity to a expanding metro area to sell, and then the metro area expands even further out into what was rural. Where's my clicker?
Yep. I like to talk about food.
So a lot of times in the rural area, while the rural village is compact, you have to travel further to get to major healthcare, to go to a major grocery store. Some people still live in the rural village, but travel to the city to work. So a lot of times you have more transportation costs because you have longer distances to drive to get to services.
And this is very characteristic of, I have a friend that lives in a small town, outside a small town in north central Washington. And she was a nurse that worked in the regional hospital. It's the only hospital in the county that's in this area. It's one of the least populated counties in the country. And she lives literally about 20 miles away from the hospital on a little farm. And this is very similar to what she's got to do. The grocery store is 20 miles away, the hospital is 20 miles away, work is 20 miles away, and if she wants to go recreate someplace, it's 15, 20 miles away. So everything's by car. And long distance, and the thing is, of course, all the roads are level surface A, so it's real great, there's no problem. The only problem is winter snow. She lives right outside of, right near the Canadian border, north central Washington. So, yes, go ahead.
The irony is that she has better time than what's going on in Florida.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I'm plus drive.
Yes, but she puts a lot of miles on the car also.
Okay.
She puts a lot of miles on the car. And this is often, you'll see, spare cars sitting in the, at the farmhouse because they got to take parts from one to help the other, to the same type of model. Things like that, anyway.
So in rural areas, typically healthcare is, you might just have like a generalist, a family doctor in the rural community. And so you have to drive to get any kind of major medical services to go to the hospital. So in the rural community, a lot of times government agencies are the largest employer. And as Henry was just mentioning, long commutes are typical. Typically, the government jobs aren't all that high paying. In the rural area, there's a lot of unemployment. You typically have lower educational levels of the residents in the area. And a lot of communities have, just one single employer. And so then when that employer suffers hard times, then with layoffs and or closing of factories, then the entire community can suffer. In the rural community, you see a lot of manufactured homes, mobile homes, because they are affordable. But in rural communities, homes tend to be more affordable, so people can own, where if they lived in the city, they'd have to rent. So rural communities tend to be a source of workforce housing, of affordable housing. So the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, is a federal program that can be used for rehab. If you click, do you get rehab? Rehab is one of the purposes of the program. So rural communities that might be in decline, maybe houses have been basically abandoned because the residents moved into the city. Federal monies can be used to undertake renovations for deteriorating structural conditions and lack of maintenance. And so CDBG, it's like in areas like Palm Beach County, the county administers the program to smaller cities. I think you have to have 50,000 population to be a entitlement city yourself. So like in my cities, in Lake Park and Palm Springs, we're entitlement cities through the county and get our annual allocation through the county, and so then have to do our reporting to the county. But CDBG can be used for economic development, for rehab of housing, for construction of public facilities, whether it's streets, sewer. We use it for parks, park improvements. So in the rural areas, we talked about, there's a high poverty level that is continuing. The minimum wage doesn't help at all, but it tends to be government or rural type jobs that you find with the rural area, and so it requires or necessitates then the families living in the rural area to seek additional assistance. And so some of that assistance is through, I think if you click on the next slide, the TANF, yep, which is temporary financial assistance that provides them 60 months of benefits while they're going through a tough time. But also the WIA that provides workforce investment housing, like, or activity like skill development, retraining, and try to help them get into other jobs through skill development. So in the smaller rural planning department, a lot of times it's just you, so you do everything. And so, but a lot of times you get into the politics because the mayor tends to be the manager also. And since everybody knows everybody in the small town, it gets very political. And so you get a lot of conflicts of interest. And you have a lot of people looking over your shoulder and questioning some of your programs that you're trying to implement. And it's just can be aggravating because trying to bring about change can be very cumbersome and slow.
We're having slide differences between.
So in the rural economy, it's not what I have. So we talked about a lot of times you have the government or government agency, whether it's school board, a hospital, a manufacturer, a mine, as the major employer in addition to farms around the area. Okay, let's guess what the next slide is. In rural areas, a lot of times you have a traditional main street. And so there is a Main Street program that's a 4-point approach to revitalizing traditional downtowns through economic restructuring by promoting new businesses. In some of these quaint little villages, they can promote more businesses oriented to visitors who want to come and visit the quaint little village, like art galleries and coffee shops and B&Bs and vintage stores. Main Street program also can provide funding for marketing of the area, of the downtown area. It can be used for little grants for improving the facades of the structures and doing aesthetic type improvements, as well as just coming up with plans to preserve the charm and the history of the downtown as you're trying to bring revitalization.
And they're having questions on the exam on the Main Street program. They're not often, but you'll see them in the past, their comments that somebody got a question about it. We don't know what the question's about, but it's about the Main Street program.
So I don't know if it's a question whether you need to know the difference between economic development versus economic growth.
We had in the past a question that did get into that a little bit. We haven't seen it recently, but this is just a little indication of what the difference is between economic development, rural area, rural small town area, and economic growth.
So in economic development, it's kind of the philosophy that a rising tide floats all boats, that by helping one segment of the community, it helps lift up the entire community, versus economic growth, which is more focused on job creation and bringing in new businesses to create new jobs. So sustainability, so the transition of rural to suburban on the city fringes, we're losing the farmland. But that's creating the real life farmers who are, family farms who have been there historically. We talked about these people actually moving to the rural villages because it's quaint, because they can telecommute, they can, or they're in e-commerce and they don't have to be physically in their office in the metro area every day.
And we'll see it, we'll see it some more later when we talk about urban form and things like that, when we get into sustainability a little bit more. But there's two definitions that come up on the exam. This is one of the definitions. This is the old classic one by the Brundtland Commission, which is to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's the classic definition. The other definition that comes up is APA's from their sustainability framework. And it started coming up since they revised the exam in 2017. And that is, sustainability means improving the quality of people's lives while living within the capacities of supporting natural and human systems. And unfortunately, you need to know both of them, and you need to know which one's APA's and which one is the classic one. Okay? Because they'll come up in different ways on the exam.
I'm sorry, what was the name of the prior one again? The APA and the?
Brundtland Commission. It was done in 1987 and is the classic one used by everybody else, UN and EPA and all sorts of other groups. There's lots of definitions of sustainability, but this is the classic one. To meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And actually, what's interesting, if you look at the evolution of that concept, it came out of, there's an earlier, when we talked about NEPA, the NEPA process, you saw language that was almost like this in NEPA that was done in 69 and 70. Okay, it became law in 70, passed in 69. So the concept's been around for a while, but this is the classic definition, but this is APA's new definition that they decided they feel more from a planning focus is a better definition. Okay? Yes.
On your prior point, is there a name for that process where people move? Because it's not gentrification, where people will just move out. Is there an actual name for that? Where people moving onto remote areas, like just for?
Two remote areas?
I would use gentrification.
Yeah.
It's still called gentrification, even though it might be
Yeah.
just a few people here and there?
Well,
But
it
it's
just
just-
tends to be, in some areas, tends to be more than that. Like a classic example in Florida here is Apalachicola, okay, small town. And what happened is it once upon a time, 100 years ago or so, it was a big sailing port city. And so there's some big old homes, like the beautiful old historic homes that are there all over. But, you know, as some of the commerce on the Apalachicola declined over time, its value as a port changed to where it became more a shrimping port and an oyster, and for oyster and things. It was pretty much all around seafood. Well, a few years ago, it started to get discovered as a artist community. So you started to get artists moving in, you started to get gentrification of the retail that was there. You got a cordon bleu chef that opened a restaurant. This is a little small town in the middle of nowhere, Apalachicola, very rural area, but it started to become gentrified. The other thing that helped with that, I guess, was that the barrier island had resort homes that were being built on it. A lot of large for vacation rental type places, like at Cape Cod, they were mostly single family homes that were being developed. There weren't a lot of townhomes, weren't very many high rises. They had caps on what they could build. So it became known as a touristy area on the barrier island. But then gradually with time, people started to move into there. I know where my friend lives in Tonasket, Washington, you have people that get tired of Seattle and the bustle and hassle, and particularly now that they can do work remotely, they go there because of its beauty and because of things like that. Mm-hmm. And so they've started to buy up places, made it more expensive in some places. That starts to roll very gradually, starts to do gentrification. You know, you think of gentrification in larger cities, and you think of gentrification like in the Keys, okay, where you get people that want to move into there, driving the price up, driving out the workforce, housing affordability out of the area, particularly since they have a rate of growth ordinance, things like that. So you get all these sorts of different little things. I don't know if you have any other comments on that you want to. I don't know of any other term besides gentrification right off the top. There may be a term, but I don't know it.
Mhm.
All right. That is, let me see how we're doing on time here. We're doing fine on time. That's it for Kim's presentation, but we have some questions. Real small town questions. And Kim, feel free to go have some Cuban. I don't know what you brought, Kelly, but I'm sure there's black beans and rice and looks like there's some roast beef and
Good, yeah.
chicken, something. And then actually have, sometimes you can get some of their special Cuban chicken. that they have. All right, so let's start some practice questions. I'm going to snitch the mic away from Kim and let her go get something to eat. Let her go get something to eat if she wants it. Well, first of all, did anybody have any other questions for Kim on rural small town planning before we go into the questions? Online or in class?
Well, you know what I didn't talk about?
Okay.
Ha, took it back from you.
Take it back the mic from me.
So, and I'm going to create a slide for next time.
Okay.
So something else, another pressure that rural communities are experiencing is the farm to table movement. In that
Okay.
it's kind of chic now, farm to table. But what's happening is while it's creating new markets, the farmers, the family farms are being bought out. And so the farmers are coming in and growing specific crops that they already have a relationship set up with a specific restaurant or chain of restaurants. So they have a market. They're not going just to the wholesale market hoping someone will buy at a good price. They already have partnerships worked out.
They're not using means they get more money.
And so so they are able to get more higher prices. So it's not a true or a traditional farm transaction and that kind of commodity. It's a more urban focused transaction. And so it's really leading to boutique type crops. And so these practices are taken away from traditional farmland just for these purposes. And so I'm going to write AICP and tell them to put a question on about
Well,
farm to table
They
movement.
do, and sometimes we have it, although we don't do a separate session right now for it, but there's a area on the exam called food planning. And that, it comes up in that area, but we haven't really done a separate training on it. We can't cover everything unless somebody wants to go year round to have class sessions. So, I understand.
We're not committing that much.
Yeah, we already commit 30, 35 weeks a year as it is. So anyway, according to Randall Aarons, Rural by Design, what is not a principal characteristic of traditional small towns?
This one's tricky.
Okay,
I think it's A.
you think it's A?
Yeah, but in your slide, where you listed them all, downtown center is one of them. But all of them are one of them. Oh, it's B?
B.
Yeah, I can see B, because what does it say, neighborhoods like removed from town?
Let me get this.
Removed from bustling commercial stuff.
It says residential neighborhoods close to town but removed from commercial uses and other potential nuisances, like a suburb out sitting someplace. That's not the characteristic. Remember, they typically have an edge. They typically, things are within it. Outside of it's typically agricultural. Small towns typically have residential neighborhoods within or mixed with commercial uses. They're not removed from, they're typically multi-use. Okay? So yes, it is tricky, but tricky in a different way than you thought. Does that help? Answer everybody? Let me see everybody online if I've got, everybody can. Okay, Derek, I've unmuted you, so if you'd self-mute yourself online. Deandra, I've done you. Ebony, I've done you. Okay, Hannah, let me see what question Hannah had. Yeah, Hannah, we only have one mic, so when the speaker's got it, I've got to work off the mic off the laptop. I try to talk loud, but then I've snatched it back now that I'm trying to do the principal talking, so I'll try to be better. Eventually, we may try to get 2 mics. Let me just check a little bit more on people online. Okay, Hosang, I unmuted you. Inez, I've unmuted you, so if you self-mute yourself. Janie, I've unmuted you again. Javier, I've unmuted you. Jim Martin, I've unmuted you, so if you self-mute yourself. McQued.
Now muted him.
Okay, I've unmuted you, so thank you. Michael, I've unmuted you, so if you self-mute yourself. Nicole.
In your area.
Okay. All right. Tia, I've unmuted you. Tia Boyd, I've unmuted you if you self-mute yourself. Tia Kite, I've unmuted you, so you should be okay. Tia Boyd, if you'd self-mute yourself. Okay. If I hear feedback, I'll have to turn people off. All right. Let's go back to the questions here. 65, right to farm laws are typically about
B.
B as in boy, coming to the nuisance, right?
Yes. Yep.
Right to farm law designates to accomplish one of the more following objectives: to strengthen the legal position of farmers when neighborhoods sue them for private nuisance, and 2, to protect farmers from anti-nuisance ordinances and unreasonable controls on farming operations. In most states, coming to nuisance does not necessarily prevent farm neighbors from winning in court, but a farmer usually has a stronger legal case if his or her operation was there before the plaintiff moved to the area. Right to farm laws give farmers a legal defense against nuisance suits. The strength of that defense depends on the provisions of the law and the circumstances of the case. Yes.
Does coming to the nuisance also apply to other non-farm uses?
It's primarily associated with farming and the issue of farming.
Okay. Not like a factory that was there 100 years ago.
It's all I can tell you is it's primary. It may be used other ways, but typically when it's come up on the exam, it's come up about right to farm, this protection of farming type stuff. Of the following techniques for preserving agricultural land, which would be the most effective? B as in boy, D as in dog, a right to farm ordinance. That's going to be more effective than purchasing the development rights for preserving agricultural land. Once development rights have been purchased, the land is likely to stay in agricultural use indefinitely.
That's not what it says with Quizlet, okay,
That's not where it says where?
on Quizlet,
Well,
it's okay.
sometimes I think I know more than Quizlet. All right. Generally, APA has the following type of bias. So you'll see in their questions and on the exam. If they're talking about how do you preserve stuff like agricultural or conservation lands, the more you actually control it as an end result by government, okay, having ownership of it, the more they think that is an effective way to do it. So outright buying it is probably at the top end. Just below it is purchase of the development rights, where those rights can no longer are permanently gone, okay, and cannot be reissued. All right. Below that would be maybe something like transfer development right, and then below that might be something like a right to farm ordinance. But that's not going to, a right to farm ordinance is not going to protect the land from being sold by the landowner to a developer, right? So the question's about what's the most effective way to preserve agricultural land. Right to farm ordinance will keep it from losing lawsuits and being maybe sued by encroaching development, but it won't keep it from being sold by the landowner. Does that make sense? Do you understand the rationale? Because this shows up in other areas besides just farming. This concept about how APA thinks about preserving stuff and protecting stuff. All right, this one a little tougher because we didn't directly talk about it tonight, but you got to use your other information that you know. In many ways, blank looks a lot like orthodox planning. Its goals include environmental protection, economic vitality, social equity, and a high quality of life, including pedestrian, transit-oriented development, controls on sprawl, diverse housing choices, compact mix of uses, protection of agricultural and environmental resources, high quality public services, and adequate infrastructure.
D as in dog, smart
Is it,
growth.
smart growth. By the mid-1990s, there was control about growth management. National movement, sometimes called smart growth, was grown. This growth management effort raised questions of regional planning, since because there was an abundance of regional coordination initiatives by local jurisdictions could be undercut by neighboring communities. Florida's growth management program, when it was originally passed, was considered a smart growth type. Maryland's was. The smart growth, you sometimes will see a question on the exam between smart growth and new urbanism. One of the differences, smart growth focused on protection of agriculture, focused on protection of environmental, adequate public facilities, anti-sprawl. That was the original focus. New urbanism moved towards that, but new urbanism was a lot more about form, okay? It wasn't about, in its beginnings, it wasn't about environmental protection being anti-sprawl, efficient use of utilities, protection of agriculture, things like that, right? Okay, here's where Kim's food planning comes in a little bit indirectly. State food policy councils ask a variety of statewide questions such as, and basically it's 1, 3, and 4, getting at loss of prime ag lands. That's where the connection is here. We don't have one of these in this state, but other states do. And they were getting at protection of agriculture. All right, getting more to the point of the type of things we talked about. Orange County is quickly losing its prime agricultural lands to new suburban development. By the way, prime agricultural lands are those lands that are best suited for general agricultural type stuff. And they're designated on soil survey maps on which lands are the prime ag lands in a state. Okay, those are the best lands for a wide variety of crops. There's also something called unique ag lands. Those are the lands that are best suited for specific crops. Like there's an area in the Redlands west of Miami-Dade where all the tropical fruit get grown, because in Florida, that's the one area that has the right soils and the right climate for growing tropical fruits. So they are unique ag lands. They're unique, that's one of the things they can grow.
You said that type of stuff is done at the state level, like Department of Agriculture?
It's done based on the soils and the climate. It's done by the federal government with the soil survey maps and designation like that. Now, the actual designation, I don't know how much a state back and forth partnership there is. Let's just look up real quick. If I could spell here. So USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. All right. The Farmland Protection Act is part, blah, 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 blah. For the purpose of that act, farmland includes prime ag lands, unique ag lands. What is prime land? Prime farmland is land that has the best combination of chemical characteristics for producing food, fiber, etc., agriculture with minimum inputs of fuel, fertilizer, etc. It may include currently in livestock or other things. Land that is of statewide or local importance other than, okay, unique farmland is land other than prime land that is used for production of specific high-value crops as determined by the Secretary of U.S. Department of Agriculture. So U.S. Department of Agriculture does the designations. They're shown up on the soil survey maps because of the soil characteristics and climate characteristics. Okay, so that's prime ag land, unique ag lands. All right. I'm going to do this last question because then I got to switch to my other presentation. Potential use of this tool for agriculture will likely involve discussion of legal principles established in. This is where we tie from stuff we learned before, tie it into this area.
D as in dog.
So I heard 1 and 4. D as in dog. Okay. We're talking about TDRs. 2 of these cases deal with TDRs. Remember, the Fred French investing was the first one in New York City that involved a rezoning land to public park use, accompanied by a grant to its owner of transfer of development rights, which could be used anywhere within a designated receiving area. However, the Court of Appeals reaffirmed the general that it may not, under the guise of zoning, be deprived of all but a bare residue of his economic property. In this case, he had land that the city wanted for a park. They were going to put it into a public park, so he's not going to get any economic value from that because they were just going to have it as a public park. They weren't necessarily compensating for him. And they said, here's your TDRs. You can use them over this receiving area, but that receiving area didn't have a market for increased development. All right. So the TDR program was good in concept, but invalid in terms of its application. That's opposed to the other case here, which is Penn Central case, where they passed a historic preservation that said, okay, we want to protect some things like Grand Central Station. You're going to have Grand Central Station left behind. We know that the air above it could be used for air rights to move elsewhere in Manhattan, and there's a hot market for that. So you're not only having an economically viable use left behind, but you're also going to have a hot market and be able to sell those for good money someplace else or develop it yourself. So in that case, they said they upheld both the TDR as well as the historic preservation ordinance that was there. All right. But the TDRs, that was where the TDRs came in. And there's some more questions here. Okay, there's a few more questions here, including transect and some more smart growth. And okay, but I do want to get to this last one, which everybody should now have down pat after Kim's presentation. No, this isn't what I thought it was. This isn't the one I thought it was. Yes, it is. Traditional small towns feature each of the following characteristics except.
B as in boy.
As in boy, low to very low density development, right? What's the density we said? Medium density. Now, and as Kim said, that's typically 4 units per acre. Now, I know some urban planners would say that's not medium density. That's right, you're big urban planners, but that's medium density, all right? Low density would be like 1 unit per acre, and in very low density, you start talking about 1 unit per 10 acres or something like that. All right? So that's rural small town planning. Should know almost everything you need to know to pass the exam now, right, on that topic. Now, you may only get a couple questions, but you know what they are.
Henry.
Sometimes the zoning, type of zoning you can do, TDRs, stuff like that. Transect zoning, knowing that T1 is, that rural preserve type, and goes to urban core T6, 6 segments, and et cetera, et cetera. All right. Yes, somebody had a question online?
Yes, I have a question. Is there a set standard for density? So going from low,
When I did a presentation on GIS and maps, I gave you a whole publication on density. Go look at that.
Okay.
Okay. Here are some of the comments. Next, I'm going to cover spatial. Oops, it says library. We're doing libraries another time. There are a couple questions that come up on library planning, actually, on the exam. Steps in library planning, give you which one of these do you do first. Another is they want to know the trip generation rate for a library. Yeah, that's a couple of the classic questions. I thought a little bit. Kim said she would object to that, but anyway. But here are some of the things. Questions on home rule versus Dillon rules, on questions regarding Native American tribes being semi-autonomous nations, not being under state or local jurisdiction. State organization question regarding governors and their cabinets. Tribal stuff. Home rule. Regional state-specific planning questions. There were more than I expected. What plan created regional redevelopment of very impoverished areas? TVA and regional planning was on there. Police power, Patrick Geddes, tactical urbanism. So you're going to leave us now, Kim? Or are you staying here to learn?
Trying to slip out quietly.
Okay. Well, I just wanted everybody to thank you for helping us on rural small town planning. So, like I say, you can blame Kim for getting me involved in this too. So, Main Street. Main Street also comes up here. Tribal concerns. Which theory on city formations deals with corridors?
Do you get into tactical urbanism in one of your?
A little bit. We touch on tactical urbanism. We touch on here and there. We touch on it, and like I said, we can't cover everything in detail, but we do touch on it. There's I give them all. I think it's probably like a little paper on 50 types of urbanism, and it's got tactical urbanism there as well as new urbanism as well as all sorts of other urbanisms. But yeah, they do get a little bit into that. All right. So anyway, those are some of the things. Waterfront planning, some of the types of things that were coming up is what considerations are involved in waterfront planning. They had one question we covered in class. Question asked about the Northeast U.S. waterfront development. They asked about types of planning issues that come up. One question about what would be consideration for water development in the Northeast U.S. What's true about waterfront development? Blah, blah, blah. Other people had others at different times. So anyway, we get a couple questions. Okay. Bye, Kim. Thanks again. So I'm going to do first a broad overview on spatial planning, which is what type of planning happens at different levels of government, particularly. And we touched on some of this a little bit, but we're going to do it a little bit more. And some of these topics get covered more in other areas, so I'll just mention some of them. Sometimes, like we talked about housing or something like that, we'll do. What are spatial areas of practice? They're planning that occurs at different governmental levels, or they're planning that have geographically similar planning areas. Okay, there's an interrelatedness of spatial areas of practice. We're going to go over this more, but planning areas are not mutually exclusive. Like the federal government deals with transportation, but so does the state, so does local governments. Okay, similar concerns are often shared. Intergovernmental coordination is needed. The larger area, the more complicated the issues involved. Geographically, they're talking about. The smaller the jurisdiction, the less expertise you may have in-house. Okay? So spatial areas. First of all, planning at the national level. There is no federal police powers. All right? Therefore, if you're a federal government, you have to use other means and powers to do things. Because under the Constitution, you don't have police powers. Who has police powers? The states, and if the states delegate it down, local governments. Okay? So how does federal planning work then? Well, you do it through money. Okay, why do we all have drinking age at 21 in the United States? Because the federal government said, if you want highway money, trust money funds, ye shall do what I say and have the drinking age at 21. Just yesterday or today, the current administration won a case that said we don't have to give money to some of these local governments that are starting to have sanctuary cities. Okay? So power the purse. You don't get this federal funds unless you do what I say. They can do it through legislation, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, things like that. They can do it through regulating permitting, such as through treaty power. This is why we have special laws on migratory fowl and things like migratory birds and stuff, is because of treaties and international treaties that we have on this between Canada, us, and Mexico. Okay. We can do the federal government can do it by ownership. This is what they do with parks. And they can do it with development. They build post offices, things like that. So they have a number of other powers they can use even though they don't have police power. What are some of the types of things that they do? Well, they do at the national level transportation. They have a highway planning history, and I'm going to give you some background on some of this in the text form for some of this that I wrote for the first half of this. Highway planning, it goes back to 1913 Lincoln Highway, which is the first cross U.S. highway that was done. I've talked about before, and we'll do it again when we have to do transportation, about 1956 Eisenhower and the interstate system, the National Defense Act, or the Highway Trust Fund money that was being done by then. Then they've had other federal aid to highway, 62 and others, and we've got now all the different T-Acts, ICE-T, Safety Lou, so on, so on. So they can do it through highway funding, through their cost sharing. The transportation, they also do interagency planning. They have their 3 Cs, continuing, comprehensive, I can never remember. And then corridor planning, TODs, and then they have things like through the Clean Air Act, they have state state transportation plan and state implementation plan for Clean Air Act. MPOs, Council of Governments, regional planning associations, all tied, they can be, they're required by federal law. The MPOs have different roles. They have citizen advisory committees. We're going to talk about more. We do transportation, and they can do rail transportation and as well as transportation improvement plans. You can get into non-highway type stuff where you get into ports, which mainly pulls in the Coast Guard, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Federal Maritime Commission. You have airports done by the FAA. You have rail done by the FRA. So all of those things are transportation. Yes, you had a question.
At one point, they're not going to put as much emphasis on acronyms.
Right.
But don't we pretty much have to know like what most of these are?
You have to know what the Coast Guard is. You have to know what the Federal Aviation Administration is, and the Federal Rail Administration. When I originally did this for APA, this was part of the 3.0 training. All right, there was, and it's all webinar based, so there's a text involved with this. We were still using acronyms, so that's why I haven't gone back and taken all the acronyms out. But they should be a lot fewer acronyms on your exam than there used to be, and they're trying to eliminate the use of acronyms. So they will spell things out. So yes, you need to know the agencies, less likely you need to know the acronyms.
I remember it was like a class or two ago, you went through the different glossaries and I wrote down that we should, you recommend us to take a look at.
Right.
Are these like types of agencies in that glossary, or is it really somewhere? Or is there?
A glossary of agencies? I don't have.
Is there a place where all like sort of these
Where you have
agencies?
all the terms.
Is there a place where you find all these agencies? I know I'm looking for some.
No.
It sounds like I'm always looking.
Yeah, no. I don't have a single source where all the acronyms are.
Okay.
All right.
I'll be the guest speaker.
Okay. Environmental protection. There are two sort of trends here. One was what was happening in the earliest 20th century, and then what happened in the late 20th century. Earliest 20th century, we got people like Teddy Roosevelt, people like that, interested in trying to do conservation and parks and all this sort of stuff, and forestry and things. So there was a whole movement to try to start to do those type of activities in the first part of the 20th century. In the late 20th century, there was a lot more, starting in the 1950s, 1960s, there was concern more about environmental pollution, degradation of the environment, okay? And that degradation, you have to realize in 1960s, we had rivers on fire. The Cuyahoga River would catch on fire routinely because of the oils and the wood and the paper and everything that was on it. You had massive oil spill like in Santa Barbara, killing the birds and fouling the beaches and everything like that. You started to have disappearance of alligators, of eagles, and things like that, that was traced eventually to DDT, causing egg thinning and causing the eggs to fail on all these reptiles that were egg laying. That led eventually to a big push under Nixon to do environmental programs, with 69 being when NEPA was done, National Environmental Pollution Act, which I talked about, forming up the Council of Environmental Quality in the President's office, and then in the White House, and then forming the Environmental Protection Agency. And so you started to get things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and then on and on and on. And then the next big real gigantic change to NEPA was in '94, when you had environmental justice added as another concern through Executive Order 12898 under President Clinton. And that was an add-on to NEPA. We talked about environmental justice. Silent Springs up there because that was probably one of the main books that triggered the environmental movement. Rachel Carson was a biochemist that brought together a widely diverse literature in multiple scientific journals showing how DDT was causing the egg thinning and causing the loss of the American symbol, bald eagles and alligators and other birds and things like that. All right. Another role that the national government has in planning is emergency management. One of the original acts was the Federal Disaster Act of 1950. We'll have a whole night when we talk about emergency management. And you got the National Flood Insurance Rate Maps, the National Flood Insurance Program, and the Flood Insurance Rate Maps. FEMA was created in '79. That's a picture, by the way, from Hurricane Andrew that I worked. And 2000, we had the Disaster Mitigation Act, DM82K, that required certain things for local governments. And then we suddenly, after 9/11, we had the Homeland Security Act that did other things. But national emergencies in an area, the Army Corps of Engineers and their role in flood protection, their role goes all the way back to 1779. Their flood-related roles today are civil engineer, flood protection, military facility building, environmental permitting, ecosystem restoration. Some examples, they are responsible for the levees around New Orleans. They're responsible for the dike around Lake Okeechobee here. And they're also responsible, the partner with the state through the South Florida Monitoring Management District on the Everglades Restoration, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program. Housing and economic development is another big area that the feds have been involved with. There's a series of 34 to 54 housing acts. You just have to know. Tanya's going to come, I think, next week.
She's coming next week.
Next week to talk about housing. The fourth, and Frederick's coming to talk about historic preservation. So those are two topics we'll have on Thursday. The 40s and 50s, we have urban renewal. 65, we have Economic Development Agency and Housing and Urban Development Creation. Then we had the Model Cities Program for Housing Acts, Section 8 Housing, CDBG. These are all things that can come up, so you need to know about them when we do the more detailed training. All right. National Affordable Housing Act, Empowerment and Enterprise Zones, which we talked about, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, other national planning areas that get into historic preservation, Secretary Standards, which we'll talk about next week, social justice, like Americans Disability Act, telecommunications. The Telecommunications Act of 1998 always comes up on the exam. Religions, RLUIPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Tribal Affairs, which we talked a little bit about, or we will tonight. Census and other data gathering. Recreation and Parks, National Defense and Security, Immigration, hot topic today, education, oil and mineral leasing, energy. These are all planning areas that the federal government gets involved in. Tribal affairs at the national level. Tribal governments combines the sovereign powers of a tribe as well as U.S. congressional acts related to treaties, statutes, and public law. There are about 573 recognized tribes that relate to the U.S. as a separate and independent nation, each having their own government laws, in many cases their own constitution, but they're subject to the power of Congress. So they are a sovereign nation, but subject to federal laws. Okay? State, local regulation of tribes. Tribal reservations and their trust lands, i.e. those lands that are held in trust for a tribe by the federal government, are exempt from state and local regulation and the state and local government's police powers because they're a separate sovereign. Okay? So you cannot even send, if a murder flees onto a reservation, okay, state troopers can't go on the reservation unless they either have a pre-existing compact with them or that the tribe allows them on the land. Other enforcement by the FBI and things like that can occur on those tribal lands. Okay? Federal agencies must consult with tribal governments prior to taking actions that affect federally recognized tribes and must assess the impact of plans, projects on tribal trust resources and assure that tribal rights and concerns are considered. Okay? Tribal use of federal laws. Tribes may utilize federal laws such as the Clean Water Act to establish their own regulations, just like a state may use them. Okay? An example, Miccosukee tribe over here in Southwest Florida set their own phosphorus standard for water inside and that comes onto their reservation. That basically killed a major development that was upstream of them, okay, just on the northern boundary, because they could not control the stormwater runoff coming on the Miccosukee's land to be 10 parts per billion. That's a very low level. But that's what the Everglades needs to not change the type of biota that's in the Everglades. Okay, that was the justification. So they used the Clean Water Act to set their own phosphorus standard, which is legal, and people have to comply with it. You can't dump water onto their lands that doesn't meet this stormwater unless it's natural runoff. Okay. Okay, now that was national level. That was all national level stuff, and then tribal. Okay, because they're like a separate sovereign nation. Now we're going to get into multi-state, where more than one state are involved. All right. The earliest example of this really is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was multiple states that done for economic, trying to take one of the most depressed areas. Remember, this is during the Depression, 1933. Okay. Roosevelt just got into power. Let's pick an area that's one of the most economically depressed areas and try to revitalize it. Multi-state, yes.
When did WPA start, and is there a correlation?
WPA is another program that's done. It was probably about the same time, probably around 33, 34.
does it overlap with the water projects? Can they be WPA funded? Or is it a separate?
Well, they're separate programs.
Okay.
Whether or not they interacted at all, I don't know off the top of my head. Senator Norris is here because Senator Norris is the one that basically sponsored the legislation to do TVA. He was from Nebraska. That was outside the TVA area, but he sponsored it, and unfortunately, he's come up a couple times on the exam. No, having to know that Senator Norris sponsored TVA. Okay. Another example of multi-state regional planning is Hoover Dam that goes across the border of Nevada and Arizona. You can see a picture of it there. Tahoe Regional Planning Agency that goes across the border of Nevada and California for controlling the Lake Tahoe, which goes across both states. Okay, so the two states got together and brought the federal government in because the federal government makes sure that these multi-state things work. All right, so another classic one is the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, where there's basically a compact between multiple states and the federal government in Washington, D.C. to try to clean up Chesapeake Bay. Okay, these are voluntary programs that were set up where the states wanted to do this. Another type of, but it's sort of a negative one right now that we're having is called the Tri-State Water War, and that's between Georgia, Alabama, and Florida as the primary three. Okay, and this has to do with what becomes the Apalachicola River in Florida. Upstream of that in Georgia, Atlanta sucking all the water out of the system. That has implications for the nuclear power in Alabama that cooling water is used, and has implications for all of Apalachicola River Bay and the shell food, the both navigation and the shell food industry that's there, which has been collapsing because the bay has not been getting enough fresh water, so the oysters are dying. So, that bay, Apalachicola, produces 10% of the nation's oyster, and it's dying right now. Go ahead.
Are they fighting it all over the Florida and aquifer? Because I know it does overlap.
There was a side issue that came up with the Floridan, which starts in Georgia and comes into Florida.
Yes.
But that been, I think, more addressed. This is really the fight over the river of this, and the river system that goes up Chattahoochee, I think, that goes up. Anyway, the one that goes through Atlanta, the river part of it, it goes up. We can look at the tri-state. If you remember, and then there's another one that's also water related that's come up in the Great Lakes, and this was a concern that more and more states were wanting to take water from the Great Lakes for water supply. And the states that border the Great Lakes, as well as Canadian provinces, got concerned. So there's an international compact done between several of the Canadian provinces and the states that have the Great Lakes. And they basically drew a line and say, within this area, you can deal with water supply and demands. It's a drew a line near the shoreline and say these areas can deal with water supply usage from the Great Lakes, but no areas outside of that. So it's a restriction on the amount of how water, because the lakes were starting to go down, okay, particularly Erie, I believe. And so there was a concern that too much water is being taken from the lakes for water supply purposes. So they did an international compact to try to deal with that, called the Great Lakes Compact. Yes.
Is there any commonality between the Great Lakes Compact and, like, say, the Colorado River? And I'm not trying to.
It's a different. They're only in the sense that there's water fights and water issues, but you get into Western water right law when you get out there, and you get into who really had the first right, and because basically California is stealing water from other places. Anyway, another multi-state thing that can go on planning is for tourism and economic development. 3 examples real quick here are the Appalachian Regional Commission. This shows these areas here. They all, for tourism and economic development, they've gotten together and have an agreement on how to deal with issues that come up there. There's another one in the Delta. Where do you think that is? Includes New Orleans and the states above that, Mississippi Delta. All right. And then there's other ones, multi-state regional tourism and entrepreneurship project. And that is out in the Northwest, around Yellowstone and Montana and things like that. All right. Now, another major place that got multi-state regional planning is on transportation and community. The oldest one was the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey. Remember this when Christie was all involved and things like this, but this is, they control, there's a multi-state organization that controls what goes on in terms of the bridges, the airports, the ports, this whole thing in that area, all right? And that's the oldest one. That has come up on the exam sometimes. There's other ones, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, multi-state transportation agreement that's done out in the West. There's a series of interstate compacts. It said basically, the Constitution says no state shall, without the consent of Congress, this is why the feds get involved, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. So when you do things like the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency that takes a compact, you trigger the Constitution, and here's some examples of those. Chesapeake Bay Commission Agreement, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia regionally, Colorado River Compact, which we were just talking about, who gets to use the Colorado River. All those states are involved. Great Lakes Commission, the Gulf State Marine Fisheries, Multi-State Highway Transportation Agreement, Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, Tahoe Regional Planning. Those are all examples of interstate compacts. All right, yes.
What are the criteria by which their consent is granted? I mean, are other cases where their consent has not been granted?
Probably, but I don't know right off the hand.
Okay.
I'm sure the states have to go to the feds, and then the people got to pass legislation. It's got to be legislation.
Okay.
So it's got to go through the House, got to go through the Senate, got to be signed or right, you know. All right, planning for states. We've talked about this a little bit already, but federalism and states' rights. States have police powers. Federal government does not. Remember, we talked about this. Federal lands are exempt from state control. The exception to that is that states with a coastal zone management plan where the federal government has agreed to comply with certain state regulations. As I mentioned, most tribal lands, those being the reservation and trust lands, are exempt from states. Federal legislation may preempt states from certain things, like Telecommunications Act preempts states and local governments from regulating the electromagnetic radiation coming from telecommuting towers. Okay, the health effects, you cannot regulate that. That is if you're a state. States have either home rule or Dillon's rule, which we talked about. In home rule state, local governments have all the functions not preempted by state or federal law. Dillon's rule state, local governments have only those functions specifically delegated to them by the state. All right. That's Judge Dillon up in the upper right. All right. Similar national state planning efforts. We have transportation planning at both the Fed and the state. Housing, economic development at the state. Emergency management happens at the federals and the state. On the left is the federal government agency. On the right is the state agency in Florida here. Environmental protection. You have EP at the national level. You have Department of Environmental Protection at the state level. And then nothing like having some Everglades there. What are some unique state planning roles, though? Unique states have unique roles in growth management. For example, Hawaii has the zoning control. All zoning in Hawaii is done at the state level. All right. There can be statewide mandates, like Florida. Ye shall have a comp plan and implementing regulations, and the state will oversee it. Top-down planning, which is what we had originally. Now we've gotten rid of a lot of the oversight, but the oversight still remains. All right. There can be partial mandates. This is an example of Washington. If you're west of the Cascades Mountains in the state of Washington, you have mandatory have to do comprehensive plan. If you're east of the Cascades, then it's voluntary, whether you as a county or local government do comprehensive planning. So that's a partial mandate. Yes.
I have a question, it's more about the prior slide. Like say, in terms of federal, where there's both federal and state. So for example, say there's a federal leg for the percentage of arsenic in your drinking water.
Right.
And then, this is my question, like, I could think environmental.
And unless preempted, the states can be more stringent than the feds.
But they can't be less stringent, obviously, because.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, when they're the same, for example, do they have to put it in the state code?
Oh, typically they try to, most of the time they try to have it consolidated. Like in Florida, the state permit will often be in essence, for the Fed for certain things.
So they'll
But
just like cite the federal.
But that'll have to be an agreement between the feds and the state. EPA will have to give it the power to Department of Environmental Protection to issue that particular permit.
Okay, but say like, for a road example, say they adopt a turning radius criteria from like the interstate system for the state system.
Well, it depends on what type of road it is. If it's a interstate road or if it's a federal highway, then you're going to have to use federal guidelines. If it's a local road done by a county.
Maybe that was a bad example, but like going back to water quality, do they have to restate? In other words, if it's going to be the same anyway, do they have to restate it, or do they tend to just?
Depends on the agreement that they have with the feds, how they're supposed to do it. They probably will say that this complies, does this also. Susan, you have any comment on that? On if you have federal permit, she's been a permitter, I've not.
Okay.
If you have, and you didn't do really water quality permit, I don't think that much, but if you have an EPA standard that's been delegated to the state to be able to issue the permit, do they cite the EPA standard and the requirements as well as the state requirements in the permit?
I don't remember.
Okay. But there'd be something like that. There has to be an agreement on them, one by one, if you're able to issue them. Otherwise there'd be 2 permits required. That happens in a lot of places.
And so I said to avoid, that's what I was getting at, to avoid waste.
There's a lot of places where it still happens 2 permits, where they can have a total agreement and where there's comfortable.
Like there's a federal arsenic standard, and there's a state arsenic.
Yeah, but see, the feds have to be assured that you will upheld their standard, and that you will enforce it. Okay? And if you're not enforcing it, they're going to take it away and they're going to issue it and enforce it themselves.
But to avoid duplicity.
That has happened.
Is there a process that whereby the lesser entity, if you will, can avoid duplicity in permitting?
Well, the issue is.
Speak up loud, Susan.
Until the executive order that Trump just issued, where he changed the
CSOs?
The Corps of Engineers permitting process,
Oh.
and released, half of the lands that had been considered to be
The wetlands.
under wetlands under federal jurisdiction.
Mhm.
What happens sometimes is that the federal requirements apply either in a more strict way, either to a larger area or have more stricter.
Anyway, across the states, there's variations in how it works. Okay?
And there are plenty of places around the country where the federal
Okay.
standards are more stringent.
So I need to go on to some other places that have unique state roles are floodplain management, health regulations, food planning. Of course, if they do a coastal zone management program and something called marine spatial planning, marine spatial planning is like zoning out in the ocean. Some places like Massachusetts do that. Say what allowable uses are out in those zones. And of course, there's my old agency that no longer exists in Florida, that ran the growth management programs in Florida. Now it's, all right. Planning for sub-state regions. Now, we call this is what we think of regional, is a sub-state area, okay? History is Patrick Getty's considered the father of regional planning. He had the Valley section, which I thought is a lot like the Transect. He's noted for his book on cities and evolution. Lewis Mumford brought his ideas to the U.S. and was one of the founders of the Regional Planning Association of America. And his classic book is Culture of Cities on City planning. The other thing here is there was a series of volumes between 22 and 29 called the Regional Plan for New York and its Environs. One of those, volume 7, we had basically the neighborhood unit came out of. Okay. And then 68, Office of Management and Budget issues are 895 requirement that basically greatly stimulated the growth of regional planning councils because it said that there had to be a regional entity that was coordinating the review of a lot of the federal documents, particularly later those that came out of NEPA. This later, after 60, it was NEPA and things like that. But there'd be somebody that was commenting for federal money and for sub-federal programs, things like that. We now know it as the circulation review. What's the term I'm trying to think of? Susan. 895 process with clearinghouse review. We now call it the clearinghouse review process. It's done by the regions. Okay, so this led to a lot of regional planning agencies to deal with the clearinghouse reviews. So there was a lot of intergovernmental coordination, collaboration, technical assistance. They deal with typically plan development, land use planning, grant preparation, and sometimes mandated planning, such as they can be an MPO. We don't use them in Florida as MPOs, but other states, regional planning agencies, or the Council of Governments, COG, which is a similar concept, can be the MPO. Another thing that's done on a smaller regional basis is special districts. I've got here the map for Florida showing where the 5 water management districts are. These are regional agencies of the state to deal with water quality, water supply, flood protection, and environmental protection throughout Florida. They can be either created by referendum, which are done a lot in other states, or in Florida, they're all done by legislatively. But this is where the 5 are. You see that this is the South Florida Everglades, South Florida Water Management District that Susan and I worked for that deals with the Everglades, because the headwaters of the Everglades go up into Kissimmee Valley all the way to Orlando. Other sub-regional type of things, you can have regional planning based on either for parks, like the Adirondacks, that's the green area here in New York, or the North Carolina Outer Banks, or the Cape Cod Commission, New Jersey Pinelands, or the California Coastal Commission, which is actually a regulatory commission in California. You can do it for economic development, for air quality, tourism, transportation, climate change. My old area that I used to live in, the Finger Lakes, now has gotten to be a wine growing area. And they have a regional planning agency that tries to deal with all of their coordination of their wine tourism and things like that. Okay, now we're stepping down from regional to county level. So what's the difference between county and municipal planning? Well, often they'll have parallel services and planning in place. Sometimes you'll have consolidated jurisdictions. An example of that here in Florida is Duval, Jacksonville. The city and county have actually consolidated, so they have one entity. Other places they may consolidate only for some particular function, like Tallahassee, Leon County have a joint planning department. Do it for the city and the county. Other places you may have restricted powers. There's some states that restrict city powers inside the county, okay, that they can't do certain things. There's others where you have municipalities that are independent of the county that they're in. And the other roles are coordination, cooperation. County planning, type of things they may do is zoning, land use, emergency management, parks and rec, county roads, utilities, public health, rural economic development, natural system protection, watersheds, agricultural support. This is an example of the Ag Reserve that I did the master plan on here. That's just a little bit to our south. Here's Lantana Road, so you can see we're a little north of this. Okay, so planning for urban areas. What's the relationship from municipal to federal government? Well, municipal, local governments have to do whatever their enabling legislation allows them to do. And that may be whether they're home rule estate or whether they're in the Dillon's real estate. They have to deal with preemptions. They have to they raise often money through grants and funding. One of the issues between municipal and county often are annexations. Sometimes they're voluntary, sometimes they're forced, and trying to deal with infrastructure provision. Yes.
Does anything with respect to the Dillon versus home rule structures apply differently to counties than they would to municipalities? Or is it
Depends on the state.
Okay.
For instance, in Florida, at one time we gave counties the right to do a charter. If they did a charter, they could dictate to the cities. And Miami-Dade, for instance, has certain types of decisions that they have to agree to, like for instance, annexation or a movement of the urban development boundary. They have to agree to it at the county level before the city can do it. Palm Beach County has something that's like that, but a little weaker, where for certain things it requires some agreement by the county. But Miami-Dade's a much harder one, virtually everything.
Miami-Dade was the first charter county, and it was actually done as an amendment to the state constitution.
So anyway,
Before the
but
constitution was.
there's all sorts of varieties around the country, okay? So yes, it depends.
Totally varies.
It varies. All right, planning for urban areas. Some of the challenges and opportunities. Some of the challenges are you can have aging infrastructure in urban areas because they've been around for a while. You have blight, crime, and investment issues. You can have demographic changes. Either they're getting older, they're getting younger, they're getting racially different, whatever. You have shrinking populations like Detroit, Michigan, well, Detroit had, greatly decreasing population. You have housing affordability issues, like just think San Francisco, think the Florida Keys. You can have income disparities, think Palm Beach versus Pahokee, okay, within the same county, even inside the same city it can be that way. Cities in transition are just some one that was on the exam for a while. I don't think there's much to worry about, but there were 4 types about how cities that were failing are now trying to come back and what the difference were. And there were 4 different categories of those. Other opportunities are visioning, reimagining, reuse, redevelopment. This is an example of the first mall in Tallahassee, Northwood Mall. Publix in here and all these other mall stuff. Well, now it has become a state office complex for much of that. And they put a nursery care in there. So they have a Publix there, but they have nursery care and then state office buildings. And now it's even changing again. It's going to maybe redevelop again and do something different. Some of the concerns, of course, about redevelopment is you want to maybe focus on going into Greatfield, going in an area like this where you may have the infrastructure already in place, but you may have to worry about brownfield, potential contamination type issues. But then you've got other types of activities you may deal with funding and things like that, like taxing and financing. You may get a community redevelopment agency or downtown development agency. You may agree to improve yourselves through a business improvement district, or you may have special state or federal programs like empowerment zones or enterprise zones and things go in. You can have all sorts of urbanisms, new urbanism, agriculture urbanism, landscape urbanism, tactical urbanism, pop-up urbanism, green urbanism, all sorts of characteristics like that. I'll give you a list of different types of urbanism. You have transportation issues, both congestion management, mass transit, getting the multimodal, doing complete streets, safe for everybody. And parking issues. And this is just Donald Shoup, the high cost of free parking. He basically says that 99% of the parking in the United States is free, and that it's killing our mass transit and having very much unintended consequences. So he talks about no longer having minimum parking requirements, but having maximum parking requirements. And he's also pushed for such things as trying to cash out parking, trying to pay for parking that you'd otherwise have available at your place of business in exchange for you telecommuting, doing the other things. All right, other urban planning issues, emergency management, utility planning, historic preservation, public safety. You can get urban canyon heat island effect. This is an example, like say you're Chicago here, and if on a normal day, the rural areas will be more cooler, and you start to build because of all the concrete, you can have noticeable increases in the heat, And so there's certain types of strategies you can try to do. You can try to do green roofs and all sorts of other things, orientation to try to get away from some of the heat island effects. And then you've got smart cities, which is a topic now that we have about trying to put a lot of ways to monitor what's going on. Some suburban areas, of course, some of their challenges can be annexation into the city and zoning. Their urban sprawl problems or the lack of walkability. They may have inadequate schools. They may have aging infrastructure now. They may have edgeless city type issues where they may not have a lot of mixed use. They may have demographic shifts or blight. They can have lack of community character. And of course, you can get into the issues with housing collapses, zombie subdivisions. Those areas, like here's arrested development, combating zombie subdivisions, other excess entitlements, where you had these partially built things that collapsed during the housing crisis, and they're probably an area you want to go into. And then, as opposed to, you don't want to try to go into new areas, greenfield areas. Somebody, go ahead.
If I, for a local example, that the Golden Gate Estates, that whole giant.
That's an old type of, yeah.
Which category would that be? That would be like a zombie development. That would
be in probably if we call about an old time zombie.
Okay.
Yeah. But they're antiquated subdivision is really what they probably are. Yeah. And there's a series of them around there that was done low density, no commercial, no mixed use, and a lot of them didn't do well. And they're often GDC or other types of things, General Development Corporation type projects. Yeah. Opportunities. Trying to do mixed use in some of these areas, like Golden Gate Estates, things like that. Trying to transform edge cities. This is a classic one here. I told you Tyson's Corner was an edge city. It had more jobs and bedrooms and totally automobile access. It's centered around, started with a 1 million square foot mall and then got all this office. They're now trying to do all these. They won the APA's 2011 award for trying to do a plan that would transform them from America's first edge city into a walkable mixed-use downtown, served by a 4-rail transit station. They're trying to get rid of a lot of their parking. They're trying to convert a lot of their office or retail into housing type units, things like that. So other types of things is set them up with transit or transit-oriented development refits. Edge city, since we mentioned what are Joel Groh's criteria, this has come up on the exam. They had 5 million or more square feet of leasable space. They had 600,000 square feet of leasable retail, more jobs and bedrooms perceived by a population in one place, like Tyson's Corner. Was nothing like a city as recent as 30 ago. Then it was just bedrooms and not cow pastures. In the edge of the city, these are zones of isolated office buildings constructed at very density across large swath of urban space, which contain the bulk of that region's office spaces. Atlanta is a classic example. You got big pockets of office space, office space, office space, office space. They all seem to be isolated, but they're the majority of the region's office space. They're non-mixed use, just big office parks scattered all around suburban Atlanta. We talked about real small town tonight already, but you're trying to worry about maintaining your small town character, you access the infrastructure, health and social services, worried about your economic opportunities, your limited tax base. And of course, you can have loss of farmland and gentrification, and need to have right to farm. Yes.
I'm sorry if you covered this earlier before I came. Are edgeless cities versus edge cities generally good versus bad? I mean, from a urban standpoint.
They have problems. Both edge city and edgeless city have the problems that they're not walkable. They're car dependent. They're typically like the edgeless cities, they're typically isolated office buildings, so they don't have retail, don't have, residential, don't have other services, things like that. So they have planning challenges. Edge cities have some of those also, but a little differently.
But is edge cities closer to new urbanism?
I wouldn't say it's closer to new urbanism because it's not as much a mixed use. They don't have the residential component typically. They're just different. An edge city is more like a big one area that developed like Tyson's Corner.
Okay.
Edgeless city is like these pockets of typically office space all around Atlanta. If you go into Atlanta, inside the Beltway, there's office development here, office development over here. And there are isolated office developments all over the place that aren't really integrated into a mixed-use type of concept.
There's a lot of that south of Chicago too.
Okay, Chicago's got a fair
Are
amount.
they, are they both considered bad in terms of having insufficient mixed use and insufficient housing?
They have issues like that,
Okay.
yes.
So they're,
Okay. What are some of the planning tools for small city? We talked about this a lot. Agricultural zoning, cluster down zoning, urban growth boundaries, conservation easements, land trust, Main Street programs, sustainable development. Okay, corridor planning. Types, you have transportation corridors, you have linear facility corridors, which Susan is expert on. You have environmental corridors. Some of the considerations are connectivity, corridor management, compatible land uses, consistency in design, signage, aesthetics, neighborhood planning. We're going to have a whole separate training on neighborhood planning, but they're defined by history, geography, street boundaries, administrative boundaries, socioeconomic factors, cultural factors. Some of the planning considerations are pedestrian scale, walkability, design, scale controls, parking, recreational amenities, access to jobs, services, food, community services, infrastructure, connectivity, integration with other neighborhoods, placemaking, preservation, traditional character. So neighborhood gentrification issues, third place. Anybody know what third place is? First place is home. Second place is work. Third place is the place you go to get away from both of those and to try to relax and have fun and do things. So these are like bowling alleys, bars, other places. There are places where multiple segments of the societal civilization get together. In other words, in your bar, you can have people that are, you can have a myriad of different types of people there. And this may be the only situation where you talk to some of these people. Okay, but third place is a concept that's come up on the exam. Food access, food desert issues. Okay, the neighborhoods, you know what a food desert is? Area that doesn't lack access to lots of good food. In other words, may not have a grocery store here or not. Your food may only be gotten at the local 7-Eleven, okay, which may lack green vegetables and good meats and all sorts of things like that. All right. Neighborhood planning, a major concept, which we'll talk about, is neighborhood unit, or originated by Clarence Perry in Neighborhood Unit monograph. Became a planning concept for residential neighborhood development around schools and metropolitan area. So you had a school in the center, you had the major roads outside of it, you had curvilinear roads inside, 10% of your area may be set aside as parks. And we've talked about this a couple times. All right, waterfront planning, which we're going to spend more time on and get into as a separate look. Some of the planning issues are public access, planning to restore public tourism, limited to highways, rail, or private development. Working waterfronts, there's a concern about conversion of waterfronts to non-water dependent uses. A classic example of this, two classic examples of this is one, the Keys, where the shrimp docks are being converted into condos, and also in Fort Lauderdale, where boat repair yards are being converted into condos. Okay, those are not water dependent uses. The condos aren't, even though you like to look at them, but the others need the water to function. The water repair, the watercraft repair facilities, things like that. TDRs can be used to try to protect working waterfronts, public access. Another issue is about redevelopment associated with the conversion of waterfronts. You may end up running into brownfield issues. Okay, think about this, where you had working waterfronts, boats, copper, all this sort of thing. You may have potential contamination, right? I'm saying this because it comes up on the exam. So brownfield is a consideration about waterfront planning, because you may have potential contamination. So gentrification, loss of historically important structures, obviously an issue. Another working waterfront issue is commercial port logistics centers issues. This is because the Panama Canal has been expanding, so you need to have some way to accommodate that increase in port activity. And you may have places that are away from the water, like logistics centers, where you take the stuff and get them to the ports. And even if you have offshore facilities, you may have environmental water quality issues. You also have coastal hazard issues with waterfront planning. You got climate change, sea level rise going up. What do you think that does to a port and its capabilities and where you got? And you also have other natural and human hazards, and you now increasingly have security issues. Think about bringing a tactical nuclear bomb into a port as a terrorism type thing or things like that. Okay. All right, historic districts. Again, we're going to spend next week. It's one of the sections going to be that, but I'm just going to tell you what a district is. Historic district presents a significant concentration, linkage, continuity of sites, building structures, or objects united historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. The first historic district was Charleston, that had an ordinance protecting, was Charleston, South Carolina. The first one that had a district designated an overview was Bittaker Commission to maintain the French Quarter. Historic district planning may look at national registered district designation of districts, look at local regulatory design features like the facades, what the outside of the buildings look like. Some of their issues may be redevelopment versus reuse, rehab versus renovations, funding and regulations, the issuance of certificates of appropriateness. If you don't know what those are, you'll learn about them next week, but they're basically try to say that this meets the National Historic Register change criteria, things like that. Historic Preservation Commission and State Historic Preservation Officer. We'll talk about those. Downtown plannings. We talked about some of this, but central business districts, downtown development agencies, business improvement districts where they get together. And then, of course, you've got CRAs, which may use tax increment financing as a way to deal with it. We touched on that. And the issues may be traffic circulation, density issues, wayfinding, greening, events, tourism. And that's it for spatial areas. That's all the different categories of spatial areas. So now I'm going to real quick try to get into just some quick comments on waterfront, a little bit more, since that threw some people when they first started to see it. Okay. So 9 steps to creating a great waterfront. First, look at the public space. By orienting waterfront revitalization by public spaces, new construction will enhance the quality of existing designation, result in a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Make sure public goals are the primary objective. Waterfronts everywhere are too valuable. Simply allow developers to dictate what happens there. All right. Best solutions for revamp put public goals first, but private short-term financial objectives next. All right. Build on existing assets. Begin the public visioning process with existing assets and surrounding context. Existing industrial uses should be preserved when compatible with human activities on the waterfront. 4, shared community visioning. Community visioning is a citizen-driven initiative, looks at goals, set stage, think boldly, make breakthroughs, achieve on their waterfront, create multiple use designation by tapping the power of 10. Most efficient way to propel a vision is set a goal of creating 10 great destinations along the waterfront. Okay, trying to get something like that. Connect destinations along the waterfront. Waterfront that is continually walkable with a variety of activities will successfully link different destinations, allowing the appeal of one to strengthen the place as a whole. Best waterfront use parks as connective issues. The world's best waterfronts use parks as connective tissue, using them to link other high-profile destinations. Baltimore, for instance, has that type of activity. Maximize opportunities for public access. It is essential that the waterfront be accessible for everyone to the greatest extent possible. Access also means that people can actually interact with the water, from swimming, fishing, to picnicking, dockside, feeding the ducks. Obviously, what may be able to be done in Palm Beach is different than what may be able to be done in New York City, just because for a lot of different reasons. But balance environmental benefits with human needs. Marine biologists and environmentalists promote the restoration of natural seashores, at least where the marine uses do not dominate. So advocate replacing crumbling bulkheads with natural vegetation. but this natural restoration should not preclude human use. Start small to make big changes. Good public places don't happen overnight. No one has all the answers. Placemaking is all about doing more than planning. Yes, go ahead.
What about the trend away, like obviously historic places like Manhattan, but not just container shipping, but moving the transport of goods away from, in concentrated areas, away from just the regular waterfront?
Well, that gets into ports, and that gets in logistics centers, which we talked about earlier, having other places to try to do some of that. But you get into other security issues and things on and on.
But is that considered part, relocating those functions away from?
Well, it could be if they're not water dependent, if they're not necessary to have to be there on the waterfront. Why have them? If they can be done someplace else, why have them? I'm just going to give you this and let you look through a little bit, but New York City has adopted special zoning regulations affecting waterfront development. They have bulk regulations. They tailor the regulations to waterfront sites. They give a sense of openness at the water's edge is ensured by rules controlling height, the length of buildings parallel to the shoreline, the footprint of towers. They have public access requirements, some of these same things you just saw, required to provide and maintain public open space at the water's edge with pedestrian links to upland communities. Just give you a couple of examples. We're honored about the water's edge or being able to enjoy it out there. Waterfront public access areas have three components: shore public walkways, upland connections, and supplemental public access areas. Okay. These may be for active recreation, such as dedicated bike paths, etc. Visual corridors. Waterfront zoning also requires visual corridors, which are open areas that provide unobstructed view from upland streets through a waterfront zoning lot to the shoreline. So being able to see the shore, even though there's other development here. Here's an upland connection visual corridor in Brooklyn. All right. Visual corridors, which are not required to be open to the public, may contain certain obstructions such as parking and trees. Waterfront access plans. These allow for the modification of public access areas to address unique conditions in specific areas. These adopt waterfront zone, govern public use, height, setback requirements, etc. for a particular area. That just gives you, that's just a taste. I'll give you more stuff on this you'll look at, but it deals with most of what we wanted to try to touch on. The last thing I'm going to give you here is a thing about coastal zone management. So that does come up on the exam a little bit. And I want to go to, just by the way, there's a little balloon at the top here. Go to PDF page 35. Okay. So that just tells you, don't read the whole thing, but what I wanted you to pick up on was down on page 35. So you can just go here, 35. Okay, so local coastal zone management programs. Planners in coastal communities get involved in coastal zone management through programs that are funded by state coastal zone management programs, such as the National Flood Insurance Program. In states where local planning either mandated or encouraged, like Florida, has become standard practice for local government comprehensive plans to include implementation directives that aim to fulfill state coastal zone management goals. We have a coastal zone element, right, in our comp plans, if you're a coastal county. Outside of the context of federal and state regulatory funding programs, there's a long history in of waterfront revitalization. U.S. cities have been major hubs in shipping, lumbering, fishing, shipbuilding, and energy industries. Many waterfront cities, the downward economic spiral is followed by several neglect. Many coastal have begun to recognize their former industrial waterfronts as assets they can use to leverage economic comebacks. What else? Many also had goals to protect and maintain viable waterfront industrial uses. Ports, commercial fishing facilities have been developed as standalone special areas. Baltimore's Inner Harbor is a good example of that. In '74, Inner Harbor Master Plan set the stage for the harbor's transformation from an obsolete industrial district to a waterfront tourist destination.
with open space, a brick promenade, and a space to accommodate tall ships. Harbor Place, a James Rouse decided waterfront festival market, opened in 77. Harbor Place, and knowing that it's a waterfront festival market and dealt with waterfront planning, is very successful, has come up on the exam. We talked about the other night what a festival marketplace was. 40 years after the first plan, they went to improve it. They have to deal now with damaging sea level rise. And so they're having to get into other resiliency type issues. Adaptation has been used to describe the individual action required to respond to change like climate change, adjustment in natural or humans in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Adaptation planning often starts with a vulnerable assessment that looks at buildings, infrastructure, and pollution, population, as well as cultural, economic, historical, and natural resources. And comprehensive effective adaptation plan is part of what communities do to build resilience. Resilience is building the ability of the community to bounce back after hazardous events such as hurricane, coastal, or flooding, rather than simply reacting to the impacts. Resiliency planning includes the ability to understand potential impacts and take action before, during, and after. Yes.
I'm sorry, that prior definition of resilience, just like sustainability is defined differently by different organizations. That was an NOAA definition?
That was National Oceanic Atmospheric Association.
Okay.
Administration.
Yeah, I do think it's more expansive in different contexts. The definition of resilience could be like even.
But that bouncing back is one of the classic definitions of what resilience is. The ability for the system, for the environment, the human environment to bounce back after disaster.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's used even more expansively, than just like climate related.
Oh yeah, it's not saying just climate. It's talking about adaptation and resilience planning.
But even
adaptation.
Diseases and
Resiliency is used more than just climate change. Yes.
Okay.
These are just some examples of different strategies and how the weaknesses are. How well they'll withstand certain events, things like that. Let me see if there's anything else in here I wanted to give. I think that's basically it. Just want to get down to adaptation and resiliency a little bit. And then we've got a little bit less than 20 minutes. We got about 18 minutes left. Have I bored you to death yet? No? I'm trying to hit a lot of stuff real quick.
When we do.
Just got to get down here, Susan. All right.
We have a speaker who talks about risk management and all of these kinds of issues, and it's much broader than just hurricanes.
Emergency management, hazard mitigation.
All of that. In fact, part of right now he's in Oklahoma working with local governments in Oklahoma, dealing with all of the side effects of all the tornadoes that went through there last year.
All right, but he'll be here eventually. All right. So some spatial and waterfront planning practice questions. All right. As a regional planner, you've been working with local governments in the region to protect the scenic character of an important highway. You're engaging the communities along the highway in corridor planning process. Which of the following programs guidelines would be most appropriate to use in planning the corridor? We didn't explicitly talk about this, but no clue, online or in class? C, National Scenic Byway Program, right? Provides guidelines for preparing scenic corridor plans. It's a voluntary community-based program administered by the Federal Highway Administration. Through their state departments of communities can apply for designation as state or national scenic byway for funding from FHWA. It originally was done in ICE-T, then it was done in T21. And the thing that gets confusing is it's been redone Also with Safety Lou is one of the options there. What ICE-T is, what T21 and Safety Lou are, we'll leave to the transportation planning when it comes up. Yes.
I apologize, the National Scenic Byway Program, there's no funding for that? Like, I know the one, like, say, for example, Delaware River, just north of New
No,
Jersey.
there's funding for it. Look right here.
But what is the,
They can apply for designation, and if they get designated, they can get funding
oh,
from
I see.
the Federal
So
Highway
they-
Administration.
okay, there is, I don't know why.
Right.
I missed that. Sorry.
And that's why these different programs are reauthorization. These are the big transportation bills that every few years go through. ICE-T, T21, Safety Lou. All right, and we'll talk a little bit about them. They were coming up on the exam routinely. Now they're less likely to come up, but one of them does from time to time. You have just received the contract to prepare a waterfront master plan for a small town along the river. As you work with the town to prepare a detailed scope of work, which of the following would you consider?
All of them?
All of them. Right, all of them you'd consider. All those issues be considered in developing a waterfront plan. Okay? So that's implications of Clean Water Act, yeah, water quality issues, things like that. Flood mitigation, yeah, and as well as sea level rise and things like that. Access to the water by the citizen, we just talked extensively about that, right? And then we talked about the earlier potential brownfield type issues that could be there associated with those areas, and climate change impacts against sea level rise. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, that's,
No.
the Clean Water Act, I thought
Right.
that was mostly with potable water.
It's many things.
Oh, okay. So I'm wrong.
Potable and non-potable, industrial,
So
everything.
it's everything, okay, the quality, the.
It regulates the discharge of pollutions, blah, blah,
Okay.
blah.
Thank you for-
Okay. To restore and maintain the chemical, physical, biological
The
integrity.
whole-
Right.
The whole cycle,
Remember, it deals with both point and non-point.
okay.
So it's also going to be runoff, things like that. All right.
I confused it with one of the divisions,
Okay.
I believe, the CWI.
All those issues should be considered in a waterfront
Isn't there a
plan.
water quality section of it or something?
Yeah, there's different sections of it.
Okay.
Which of the following would a federal government planner not be involved?
That'd be C.
See, regulating local land uses, right? They would be providing technical assistance to local government. They do that through a variety of programs, but they would not be regulating local land uses. That's a local government responsibility, okay?
Can you make an example for the technical assistance?
You want to give?
What do you mean?
Okay, technical assistance, let's say historic preservation. Let's take historic preservation. We'll cover that next Thursday, all right? They can provide the state or local government with information about how you qualified for listing on National Historic Preservation, or what type of activities you can do that would be good or bad in terms of keeping the National Historic. But there's lots of other programs, economic,
Like in the
environmental.
Department of Agriculture, there's a lot of kinds of technical assistance.
Yes.
They provide to farmers, the funding they provide to IFAS, which is affiliated with the University of Florida here. They do all kinds of research and investigation into different farming methods, uses of
Pest management practices, all those things.
EMPs, on stormwater management, on use of pesticides and herbicides, things like that. The Soil Conservation Service and what they do.
EPA was the one that came out with the whole sustainability. What is sustainability? How do you do it? How do you implement it? So they gave guidance on that and gave it to technical assistance to the states and to local governments.
There was a lot more of that going on until just recently. As a part of this.
Yeah. Stay away from politics.
I know, but that's the facts, okay? They're relocating a whole bunch of people from Washington DC to Kansas City, okay?
All right. 4, for many years, a dispute has ensued between leaders of a federally recognized American Indian tribe and the governor's office and state legislature regarding activities on tribal property. The governor and members of the legislature seek to regulate land uses occurring on the reservation, particularly those relating to minimum lot size. The tribe maintains that the state has no jurisdiction. In an action to enforce zoning regulations on tribal property, the state will
C.
Likely lose under a federal supremacy argument, right? While state governments have the right and responsibility to regulate to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all persons within its boundaries, there's one important exception: Indian affairs. The regulation and management of tribal property is delegated to Congress by the U.S. Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, no state or local government can exert regulatory jurisdiction without consent by the tribe. Interesting land use problems arise where the state or abutting local government seeks to protect natural resource systems that lie within tribal properties, or vice versa. As a tribe has no jurisdiction over lands outside their reservation and trust properties, seemingly endless land use conflicts can arise, particularly with respect to wetlands, groundwater, and surface management. I gave you the example of the Miccosukes, where they set their own water quality standard, and that killed a big major development north of them, upstream of them. Okay. Key issues of concern in waterfront planning include
Knock out B and D.
Why? Which one don't you think is an issue?
Sprawl.
Okay. So it's not sprawl. Which
Knock
one?
out B and D.
Okay. So you're left with A and C. So the issue is whether gentrification is an issue or not in waterfront planning. So I heard that it is, so that would be A. And the answer is A. So the loss of working waterfronts due to residential gentrification, continued retention of major industrial areas that needs to be in the water, such as boat repair facilities, significant planning issues for many coastal communities, as is sediment contamination by heavy metals from such industrial and marine activities. All right. 6, Jordantown desires to prepare a comprehensive plan in a Dillon's Rule state that has state statutes and zoning, but not comprehensive plans. C. Town will need to seek explicit statutory authority from the state legislature in order to be able to develop the plan. The theory of state preeminence over local governments expressed in Dillon's Rule in 68 case. Municipal corporations own their origin to and derive their powers and rights wholly from the legislature. Breathes into them life, the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it creates, so may it destroy. If it may destroy, it may abridge and control. In other words, in a Dillon's Rule state, local governments are devoid of authority absent explicit delegation from the state. Places in the U.S. that have multi-state regional planning entities.
Definitely too unclear on that. So it's either C or D.
C.
C. Okay. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Tower Regional Planning Agency, and Chesapeake Bay Commission, which is now New York, West Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, are examples of multi-state jurisdictions. Other examples include like the Conference of Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. That's the compact for the Great Lakes. The Appalachian Regional Commission, Delta Regional Authority. I gave you some links. Patrick Geddes wrote, which of the following books have created the foundation for regional planning theory in America?
B.
Cities in evolution, right. Wrote his idea of the city as an instrument of evolution, began to formulate his broader philosophy of regional planning. He proposed that the development of the city was just one part of a wider network, and that the city plan, therefore, was not just the relationship between streets and public spaces, but between the city and the surrounding countryside, the drama of human history being as important as geography. Urban planning, therefore, needed to take the past and geography in context. He was the first to develop the term of conurbations, ever-expanding urban communities, estimating that the east coast of America would turn into one vast city stretching for 500 miles. Geddes considered himself a poor communicator of his ideas, and he found the perfect disciple in Lewis Mumford, an American writer who would later become the most influential architecture critic of his generation. As a leading member of the Regional Planning Association of America, Mumford transformed and popularized Geddes' theories that allowing cities to grow unchecked was intolerable, promoting the ideas that people, industry, and land were an integrated network that needs to be planned. Yeah.
Can you go back up to the choices real quick just to see the other title? So Geddes wrote Cities in Evolution.
Right. Right.
Then,
Mumford wrote Cultures of Cities.
okay. And then they did.
And then C.
Together, right?
No. C. The original survey of New York and its environs, Volume 7, is known for Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit.
Gotcha.
And then tomorrow, Peaceful Path to Real Reform. Ebenezer Howard reissued as Garden Cities of Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of those you need to know.
If you remember when we were going through the history section, on the FTP site, there's links to the APA site where they have books and writers and all those different things.
Okay.
All right. The benefits of Tennessee Valley Authority TVA project, including power generation and flood control, extend to what type of area? Multi-state, right? Right. It was created by congressional charter in May 1933 to provide navigation, flood control, electricity generation, fertilizer manufacture, and economic development to the Tennessee Valley, a region particularly affected by the Great Depression. The enterprise was a result of the efforts of Senator George Norris of Nebraska. TVA was envisioned not only as a provider, but also as a regional economic development agency that would use federal experts and electricity to rapidly modernize the city economy and society. This is another example of technical assistance. Okay. TVA's service area includes most of Tennessee, portions of Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, and small slices of Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. It was the first large regional planning agency of the federal government and remains the largest. The term used to describe temporary urban infill projects is known as
D.
I heard C, I heard B, it's C. Okay, it's both. It's not radical urbanism, but it is pop-up urbanism and temporary urbanism. First, the temporary use of urban infill projects. The idea has its roots in urban tactics from the World's Fair of yesterday, considered the Columbian Exposition of 1893 with the White City. That was a pop-up, right? Built to be taken down. And guerrilla gardening and other things. We got, all right. The last one, if we can do it quick. County Administrator asked you, the planning director, to address the increasing deterioration of the county's waterfront areas with a focus on economic revitalization of the county's coastal areas. The waterfront master planning issues you will address include all of them. This is the easy one. You're right. It's all of them. It's all of them, including improving regulation, coordination, and oversight. All right. There's maybe a couple other questions here, but I'll let you do those on your own. And With that, we'll end. We told you next week will be housing and historic preservation. Okay? So there will be a Saturday session here this weekend, starting at 8:30, going until 12:45. And send me any questions you have or any other issues. And with that, hopefully everybody online was okay with what we went through. We went through some of it very fast.
There was one person who asked about economic growth versus economic development, but I think you addressed that.
All right, all right. Derek, I see that you're, that's probably because I didn't unmute you. No, you're unmuted. Yeah, I don't look at the questions panel because I can't have it open here in class because we're projecting and it blocks part of my screen if I have it open. So we have to have it closed. With that, I will say goodbye, everybody.
Bye.